Hello, everyone. Ramadan Kareem. Hope you're having a great week so far. Thank you all for joining us today. We're back with another exciting Guest Talks webinar, and today's discussion is on the importance of prioritizing well-being in education, and specifically preventing burnout in both educators as well as students. We've got an amazing panel, and you'll hear from our panelists shortly as they'll be sharing their experiences and key strategies. But first, a few bits of information before we get underway. For all attendees, you can find the control panel on the site. There's a Q&A tab and another one for handouts. You can browse and download the files at any time during the webinar. Please feel free to use the Q&A, ask us questions, as the panelists would love to hear your thoughts. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our chair and moderator, Maria Vitoratos, careers educator and coach, and founder of MV Careers, to introduce the rest of the panel. Thank you, and over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much, Danny. I'm super excited to be here. Welcome, everyone, probably to one of the hottest topics in the world of work today. Definitely something that you would have personally been touched by, or you might know somebody that has. But without further ado, I want to introduce the incredible panel in front of us today. With no particular order, let's begin with Ashley Green, who is a well-being coach of the from the Free Spirit Collective. My apologies, Ashley. She is originally from Scotland and moved to Dubai 12 years ago to teach full-time within the Emirate, spending the last 8 years teaching in an outstanding primary school. However, more recently, Ashley achieved a master's degree in positive psychology and coaching and is passionate about the well-being and mental health of children and those who care for them. She has now left teaching and works as a well-being coach at the Free Spirit Collective and Integrative Psychology Center in City Walk, Dubai. She has created many resources for educators and parents to share with children to encourage them to flourish. She has also recently published 2 children's books which focus on supporting children to discuss feelings and emotions and their character strengths. Ashley believes that the absence of mental illness is not conducive to wellness, and everyone can go beyond and flourish in life. Her areas of specialization include primary education, positive psychology, and coaching towards the personal goals of clients. Welcome, Ashley. I'm so excited to have you here with us today. Alongside Ashley, we have Beth Kerr, who is the Group Director of Wellbeing Cognita. Beth Kerr is the Group Director of the Wellbeing at Cognita, in case you didn't hear me that first time, and an experienced media commentator on the well-being of children and young people. She has been responsible for ensuring that Cognita's approach to student well-being is proactive and empowering for all members of its community. Beth believes passionately that well-being is neither a privilege nor a lottery ticket, but something that can be influenced by our actions. It is the foundation for learning and thriving, and therefore students must be empowered with the agency to look after their own well-being in school and beyond it. Beth is an experienced educational leader specializing in pastoral care and well-being and a team inspector at the Independent Schools Inspectorate. She holds a Master of Science from UCL in Child and Adolescent Mental Health and is passionate about supporting educators and families to improve the well-being of young people today. Beth is particularly interested in adolescent neuroscience, how it influences thoughts, behaviors, and actions, and the positive and negative impact of digital habits on young people's physical and mental health. Welcome, Beth. I'm so excited to equally have you here on our panel. Alongside Beth and Ashley, we have Daniel Adkins, CEO, Middle East of Transnational Academic Group. Dan joined Transnational Academic Group Middle East, formerly known as Global Institute Middle East, in November of 2009 to teach in the foundation and business programs. Dan began his career working in the information technology industry. And during his time in the IT industry, he performed IT services for companies including IBM, Dell, Clorox, Philips, Hershey's, Coca-Cola, Merck, and Visa. Over the course of 20 years, Dan held numerous management positions, including CIO and CEO. Before coming to the UAE, he worked extensively in the United States, in India, Vietnam, the UK, and the Philippines. He has taught IT professionals in various disciplines, including project management, quality management, and leadership skills. After retiring from the IT industry and founding an international school in India, he moved to the UAE in 2007, teaching at the tertiary level. Dan holds an MBA and a postgrad certificate in business research from Heriot-Watt University and has received professional certifications in project management, quality assurance, and TEFL. He has lectured at the university level in IT, economics, accounting, marketing, management, organizational behavior, entrepreneurship, and law, and has overseen the development of multiple foundation programs. He regularly speaks at public seminars on education and is a TEDx speaker. Welcome, Dan. It's so exciting to have you as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Sadie Hollins, the creator and editor of Wellbeing International Schools magazine. Dr. Sadie Hollins has previously worked as a head of sixth form at a British international school in Thailand. She is the creator and editor of the Wellbeing in International Schools magazine and co-author of Becoming a Totally Inclusive School, a guide for teachers and school leaders. Sadie now creates content for university and career guidance platforms for schools. Welcome, Dr. Hollins. It's great to have you with us as well. I have to say, I'm feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome being on this panel with all of you. But I think the one thing that we can all align with, regardless of our professional experiences, is the nature of today's topic. And I know that it's one that we are all deeply influenced by and want to be part of. And that's what brings us here today. Before we jump into the main part of our discussion, and that is prevention of burnout and really talking about well-being, I thought that we could go around the table and everyone could briefly introduce the current role they're doing and why you believe that your current work is impacted by potential burnout. I think this is really important, bringing it into context so that our audience can not only resonate with our professional experience, but also begin to see the human side of the professionals on our platform. So if we can begin with Beth. Beth, what is your current role and how is your current work influenced by the impacts of potential burnout?
Well, as you said, I'm the Group Director of Wellbeing for Cognita, so that covers about 75,000 students. And I think when you think about a flame burning brightly, that's what you want for students, and burnout is the sort of complete antithesis of that. I think three things really. I think you really realize how interconnected body, mind, work, play, all is. So burnout doesn't just sort of pick out one of those. It impacts them all, and it really is completely interconnected, as I said. I think secondly, burnout is not experienced in isolation. So it impacts families, it impacts friends, it impacts teachers, it impacts students, it impacts communities and society. And then finally, that it is so indiscriminate. It is not something that just impacts, business executives or, politicians or students or it impacts everybody. So it's completely indiscriminate, which is negative, but on the plus side, it hopefully should mean that the steps we can take to address it will also impact everybody.
Thank you so much. Definitely things to be taking away. I like that visual of a flame burning brightly as opposed to dimming. Thank you so much, Beth. Dr. Hollins, do you resonate with Beth in that whole interconnectedness of potential burnout? And if so, how does it personally impact or influence the work that you do with your clients and students?
Yeah, thanks so much, Maria. I completely agree with Beth. I think well-being and burnout are impacted by so many different things. My kind of journey into being interested in well-being kind of began with my own experience of burnout whilst working in higher education. At the moment, I work for a university guidance platform. So I've shifted away from schools, but I'm still working with schools. But I'd say my role before the one I have now was as a head of sixth form at a British international school working in university and careers guidance. And I think for me, I became interested in it because of my personal journey, but also because that's such a big transition in young people's lives to the steps they have next. And making sure that they have the tools in place to take on the challenges of that transition. So yes, absolutely. I think there's lots of different things that impact it, both internally and externally, and making sure students have the tools in place for the steps that they're about to take is what I've been really passionate about.
I want to thank you so much for setting that for us and bringing in that personal experience. I think sometimes as educators, we tend to keep the outside looking as perfectly perfect as we can, almost as a mask of protection. I really appreciate that you brought that, because what you're also bringing to this conversation is the realization that the topic of well-being and potential burnout is not on everybody else. We're all really, really impacted. And further into our conversation, I want to bring in some research that I found that really came from education and the educational institution, and of course aligning with the work that you're talking about in helping students with that transition. I think it's so important, Dr. Hollins, that we are very human when we're talking to our students and to our colleagues about our personal journey with burnout and with our own well-being. So I appreciate and thank you for allowing that to come to this conversation. Ashley, your current role is incredibly interesting, but how do you see, I mean, you've heard Beth talk about burnout, you've heard Dr. Hollins talk about burnout and prevention and the work that both professionals are. Where do you see yourself on that spectrum in terms of the work that you're doing right now? And how do you, when you think of prevention or when you think of well-being and burnout, how does that land for you in your worldview of the work that you're doing and in your own personal journey?
Mm-hmm. So like you said at the beginning, I was a teacher for 12 years here in the UAE, but it was in the primary sector. So you get a kind of insight into that stage, and it's great to have such a variation here. We've got high school and then university also, so we've got a good picture overall. And actually my master's research was into teacher wellbeing. I wanted to find out about the teachers that self-reported as flourishing, which understandably was a smaller amount than some of the other percentages. And I just found that fascinating because, of course, there's always research around this, but there was research about burnout from the year 2000, and it was saying the exact same things that are happening now, except now we've had COVID and technology and all the extra things on top of it. So I did experience burnout myself at one point in my career, and thinking about how that informs my work now as a wellbeing coach. I do have clients that come for coaching sessions that aren't necessarily looking for clinical support or therapy as such, but then more work around goals of their own wellbeing, which for me is strategies kind of rooted in positive psychology. But also I do work with a lot of teachers who are reaching that point of burnout and they're looking for preventative strategies. So just one more thing quickly on that. I want to say one of the things that I found was a good buffer can always be teachers or educators and students wait until the holiday and then they regroup, recharge their batteries, and it's this there isn't a balance between how hard you work and then you're often run down at the holidays. So it's almost putting those preventative barriers in place, like when you feel well. So like now, lots of teachers are going on to spring break and lots of students. So to me, I'm like, okay, now's a good time when you're chilling out to sit and think about how am I going to look after myself next term.
Do you know, Ashley, I also came across some research on primary education. In fact, it was based on that early education, kindergarten, that foundation stage. And what really shocked me was the misunderstood roles of primary school teachers, in that there's an assumption that they're playing all day. So how stressful can it be? But actually, the impact of strain and stress in that research that was looking at participants who were early years teachers showed that the strain and stress was surmounting to such an incredible amount that it actually was increasing the thoughts of leaving teaching at that early stage. So I really appreciate the perspectives that you're going to be bringing today. And I think there's so much to be said. I think sometimes, and Dan, this is where I want to kind of bring you into this conversation. I think sometimes, and I know Dr. Hollins, you already said about working in higher education and that burnout, but with Ashley talking about early years and primary school, there's almost like a spectrum of the higher you are in education, the more stressful your job should be. Dan, tell us about the experiences that you have, because as a CEO, you're not only in higher education, but you're also on the recruitment side and managing people. How do you find that your role is influenced or impacted by burnout potential, trying to find that balance for yourself, for your colleagues, for your team members? How does it look like from your worldview?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And there are really three aspects that I deal with at Curtin every day. The first is with my senior team. We all tend to be working 70 to 80-hour weeks, which most people would consider a formula for burnout. And we've been doing this, most of us, for between 8 and 15 years. So we've got that aspect. Then we've got our teachers. And as teachers and lecturers are a caring profession, we do run into care or burnout where teachers have given everything that they've got, showed all of the empathy that they could, and have gotten burned out either from just the sheer load of it or from students not being responsive and reacting in ways that they wouldn't want to. And then we see it on the student side. And this is probably the biggest area that we deal with on a regular basis, because most of the adult professionals have had some experience in how to deal with burnout. But for the students, the jump from secondary school and the way things are done there and the requirements on them there to what's expected of them in university and the greater level of self-responsibility is very often too much. And we see a lot of first-year students exhibiting signs of burning out, and we do lose students who burn out and decide to drop out of university and give up on the dreams that they had around that.
Thank you, Dan. There was a little bit of a lag there, but what I heard you say, and just bringing it together, is you're seeing it on those different levels, from your senior team to your lecturers to also your students. But you've also highlighted something that I think Dr. Hollins was also highlighting in her introduction, in that those first year students who would have been the students that Dr. Hollins would have been working with, not really being able to manage that transition well, and burning out very quickly, and unfortunately losing themselves on that whole path towards their education, their future careers, and of course their own well-being. I don't know how all of you are feeling, but I'm already excited about what's coming next in this conversation. Anybody just popping in right now, we're talking about well-being and really looking at the prevention measures of burnout. But before we do that, I think it's really important to bring this topic of well-being into context. In my research, I came across many different perspectives of what well-being should be. In fact, one of the researchers even coined it as well-living instead of well-being. So it's definitely a trending phenomenon, but I do believe that it's very complex. So I thought what we could do right now is unwrap it based on our perspectives. And I think the one thing that we will all resonate with is that well-being, I don't believe that it's universally defined as of yet. I do believe that there are trains of thought, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So I don't want for anybody listening or watching or even on the panel to feel like there's a right or a wrong answer. And I think that's the journey of well-being. So if we can go back around the table, Dr. Hollins, what does well-being mean to you? And how do you know, now that you've come through that personal journey of having experienced burnout, how do you know when you've done enough to ensure that your well-being is achieved?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I completely agree. It's a really elusive concept to define, and I think that that's okay, because I think it's different to everyone, and there might be some common themes. I think there is some common themes that everyone's looking at in terms of well-being. But I think for me, I just kind of think of it quite simply as well-being is being well and also functioning well. So it doesn't mean that I'm in a state of happiness, because I think that's quite a fleeting emotion. But generally I'm feeling better than I'm not. And also I think I'm able to react to my environment in a proportionate kind of way. So it doesn't mean that I'm not having bad days. It doesn't mean things aren't going wrong, but I'm able to keep perspective. I'm able to bounce back. I'm able to see the learnings from things. So I think for me that it's a zone almost that I would like to stay in more than I'm not. And there's certain things that I can do that help me. So for example, work is really important to me. It's where I get a real great sense of purpose. And I think if I'm aligning my values with my work, that impacts on my well-being. If I'm spending time with people that kind of fill my cup rather than, then that kind of helps my well-being. So I think I've identified things that make me feel good and help me be in that zone more often than not. But I think sometimes that's impacted by what's happening to us. So if we're in a work environment where our values aren't aligned, we might need to lean more heavily on other stuff. So whether that's our support network, whether that's hobbies outside. So I think essentially it's very simple, but it's also very personal in terms of like how we get there and if we know they're there or not.
Thank you, Dr. Hollins. You've nailed it in terms of what I'm coming across, that it is very contextual and it depends a lot on one's perspective of what they believe. I think you described it as your zone, what that zone will be. I think the assumption sometimes is, are we aware of what that is? And I think sometimes as educators, we don't have time to really reflect on it. Ashley, was it you who said about teachers waiting until a holiday to kind of recoup and find themselves again? Would you say that well-being for you is something that you get to when you have time, or do you look at that completely different because of your role today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you ask in that way, because it is such a, like someone was saying, I think it was Dan earlier, you just can put everything in the teaching, and you really just rely on this way, and then I sought help. I spoke to different people, did some coaching, like different things around, but just did that and find that way in daily life to find that balance. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashley. Moving around the table, Beth, what would you describe well-being to be for you? And how do you know when you've achieved a sense of well-being?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because when I started at Cognita and was tasked with this role of improving student well-being, the first thing I said, we need a shared language. Otherwise, how on earth can you go and help students understand what it is if you haven't even got that? And as Sadie said, there are lots of different ones. For me, and this is how we define it in our Be Well Charter, it's kind of a sense of contentment. So you feel at peace with yourself, but also excited for life, and that you're flourishing across the social, emotional, physical worlds. And I think linked to that is knowing what things contribute to it. So it's one thing knowing what well-being is, and most of us could tell you if you felt well or not. Do you feel okay? Yes, no. The next bit is, okay, I don't feel great. What might be contributing to that? So knowing what things contribute to well-being, I think is critical. We talk about sleep, diet and exercise, relationships, connecting, doing and giving. And we look at those all the time. And I think if you speak to anyone who has good well-being at the time, you'll find that those things are in fair balance. And in terms of if I've done enough to achieve well-being, I actually think we need to reframe that. It's not a destination. I think if you sit there and think, oh, I'm well now, you're going to have that smug face for a very short period of time, and then something will derail you. So I think almost thinking of it as not something that you achieve, but something that you strive for every day, and you take it a day at a time. You think, okay, today I feel like this. I need to do a little bit more to feel a little bit more rested, or whatever else. So I do think it's something that you need to reflect on all the time. And you mentioned a few minutes ago that thing of being self-aware, and I think that is something that we are not great at doing, and teachers particularly, perhaps because time is probably the most precious resource they have, and they don't have much of it. So there is very little time to just stop and check in on yourself. And if you don't have that ability, then you're not going to be very good at assessing where your well-being is.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Ashley. And I think we might have lost Dr. Hollins. Oh, she's back. And bringing it round to Dan. Dan, how would you define well-being for you? And in your role as CEO, looking at the 3 layers that you described to us, from your senior leaders to your lecturers and professors to your students, how would you, or how do you, as an organization and institution, translate what well-being means for the entity?
Thanks, Maria. So, for myself, I like the old Greek concept of eudaimonia, feeling completely fulfilled and in line, as Dr. Hollins said, with my purpose and values. Within the organization, we are on a regular basis having sessions with our team and with the students, talking about the areas of well-being and the things that Beth talked about, where they need to be focusing on sleep, nutrition, exercise, having connections, doing things that are bigger than themselves and that benefit other people other than themselves. And we find that this is very helpful. We also make sure to have a health and well-being coach on staff who is there to meet with anyone from students to faculty one-on-one and help them with where they are. And I think Beth said it well, where it's not a destination, it's something that has to be worked on every single day. And when I think of well-being, it's not a matter of, health meaning not being sick and so forth. It's how good can I feel? How productive, how fulfilled can I be? And let's really push that boundary and see how far we can take well-being.
Thank you. So important. As I'm listening to everyone, there's an elephant in my room, and I don't know if you feel it as well. And I feel like I have to bring it right to the forefront, because I know somebody watching this right now might be thinking, you guys are making it sound so easy. You're making it sound so simple. But the reality, especially for teachers, because we are talking about the context of educators right now, is it's almost a dark secret that we're not really allowed to talk about. It's a vulnerability that you might share with someone you trust, but you beg them never to tell anyone. And that's something that I've come across in my own experience as an educator. As we're going around the table right now, what I'd like to kind of bring is, if you can share some of your strategies or some of the clues that you identified, knowing that someone you worked with or someone you taught, or maybe even a parent, possibly could have been red flagging some of those really important cues that we need to understand, because I think sometimes we don't know we're burning out until we've actually burned out. And it's almost like, I know, Beth, you were saying it's not a destination, but it's almost like we're driving our bodies on empty for as far as they can go as educators. And as Ashley was saying, probably trying to get to the next break or the next holiday. So if we can go around the table, Dan, can we start with you and help us to identify what some of the signals that you were able to pick up on, either from colleagues, from yourself, or from your students, letting you know, wait a minute, there's something going on here and I'm concerned?
Yeah, so the things that I see very often are a drop in productivity, a significant change in attitude, and interestingly, I see it go 2 ways. Some people go into more of a depressive, slow mode. And then I've seen others who go into almost a manic situation where they are feeling burned out, but they're trying to prove that they're not and that they can just tough through it. And they get frantic at trying to do things. And then I also tend to see that people start behaving in ways that aren't normal for them, whether it's their attitude or they are now binge eating, or they're eating things that they normally wouldn't, things of that nature that just show that within them there's something out of balance or something that's not in sync. And that's when we reach out and we try and get them with our health and well-being coach so that we can diagnose exactly what's going on and provide them the support they need.
Would you say, Dr. Hollins, thank you so much, Dan. Would you say, Dr. Hollins, from your own experience as well as the experience you have in your career, that there are tangible signs similar to the ones that Dan has mentioned? Or would you say that it was more subtle for you and maybe for those around you?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're talking about burnout, I would say, I guess it happens differently for everyone, but I think it can be like a slow burn. I think it can happen over a period of time. And so it's not always easy to see straight away because it's not such a stark contrast in terms of your behavior. But I think if you know people well, like Dan's saying, like you will see a change in them and their behaviors. I think for me, one of the things I'm aware that I did, and I think I've seen this in other people, is like a real increased like negativity and cynicism about work. And I think it's like everyone has a bad day, and everyone, there's comfort in sharing that with others. Like that's part of our bonding experience. But I think when we're getting stuck in that cynicism towards our lives, towards our work, I think that's where, for me, there starts to be a flag that there could be a problem there that goes beyond just not liking that particular situation.
So true. Thank you. Beth, in your role as a group director of well-being, do you feel that it's all being put on your department? It's kind of like, we said that it's not one thing, but then suddenly I heard Dan mentioning it as well. Like we see the signals and then we kind of bring in our coaches. Beth, do you see that it kind of becomes the responsibility of one department to kind of manage everyone's burnout? And if so, what are some of your strategies to any leaders watching this right now where you can say, hold on a minute, it's great to have a team like ours, but it really is an interconnectedness that we talked about right at the beginning. I believe, Beth, you mentioned that interconnectedness, that it's not an isolated incident, so it needs to be shared by everyone in the organization.
Yeah, I think the point is that we want to pick it up before it gets to burnout. When it gets to burnout, and students particularly, or members of staff have mental illness and mental disorder, they need then more expert help. And that's where that it's not fair then to ask teachers to support or friends to support, because they need more specialist help then. I think, and it's quite hard, as Sadie said, it manifests itself differently in everybody. What we do know is the things that contribute to well-being, and I'm going to pick out sleep particularly because that is the number one sort of factor that is disturbed in every mental health condition, and it's the number one thing that medical professionals will try to target to improve burnout. So if we try to ask those questions, they're not as invasive. Any teacher can ask that, parents can ask it, you can ask your friends, how did you sleep last night? You look tired today. And then you start thinking, gosh, they look tired, they haven't slept very well for a few days now. You can get them to measure that as well. You're picking it off there rather than waiting for that to contribute to what invariably will become burnout. So I think it might be easier to try to identify the things that contribute to burnout. So sleep is one. When people say, I haven't got time to exercise, I haven't got time to eat properly, I haven't got time to see my friends. So that I haven't got time is the result of that is that one of those key things to our well-being is being eroded or not contributing enough. And that's the sort of time that you want to try to pick out at. And the other thing we really try to do is, because it manifests itself so differently for everybody, you can't just assume that you will pick it up, particularly with people you don't know very well. So making sure you ask, how are you doing? Make sure, is there somebody for every student that they could go to? Don't just assume there is, because some students are less confident, some members of staff. Is there someone that they would always check in? Because I think having that person that would just ask early enough, and they might not pick up the serious disorder, but they might pick out that they're not sleeping or they haven't exercised, haven't eaten, and that's when you can be more effective, I think, with your interventions on a school level, rather than waiting until it needs medical or clinical intervention.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing that spectrum. I think it's important also, and it's come around several times, about being self-aware and identifying where you are on that spectrum. Ashley, as we move closer to the work that you're doing, not only do you help children, but you also help those who care for children. Would you say that teachers have the time to be picking up on these signals? I know it's important, so we're not debating the importance of it. I'm just saying, are we putting too much again on the shoulders of a teacher, when at the same time, as educators around, we've already identified that personally, we've all had some experience with our own burnout or our own disbalance in our well-being? How do you approach that, Ashley? And what are some of the signals that a teacher should identify in themselves when they feel like there's too much for them and they need help?
Okay, I hope you can hear me okay as well. I think I was having some connection issues the first time, so I'm sorry about that. Kind of threw me off. Yeah, it's one of the things that I think is really important in this whole field of education is like the investment of well-being, like moving away from the kind of tick box aspects that sometimes is manifested within the industry as such, but it's like investing in training. So one of the things that we offer is psychological first aid. So you begin to recognize symptoms within yourself, and the more that emotional intelligence is talked about and learned about within yourself, you can start picking out things in other people. And like you said, it's not something that we want to place on the shoulders of teachers, because we all know people in education do above and beyond. They do huge amounts of work, and there's so many responsibilities that they have. But also, I think investing in training in them so that people can understand if they're reaching like stress or physical, mental, emotional exhaustion, they're feeling overwhelmed, and it's learning that it is okay to put boundaries in place, and that is part of, even though it's not the responsibility as such, but leadership can help set that environment, and then teachers and people in teams can then offer solutions, so it's having a safe, psychologically safe space to be able to come with issues that people are facing, and then using that data to then inform the training that should come next that will suit in that context.
Thank you. That was much clearer. Thank you so much, Ashley. That's incredible. And I appreciate that perspective that you're bringing in. So I had another elephant kind of creep into the room. I apologize if I'm going to throw everyone off, but I think organic conversations like this, we need to kind of get off of our script sometimes and kind of go with that flow. And I'm going to go there right now. Being the devil's advocate in the room, as I'm hearing everyone talking, again, that word, is it safe for an educator to be really honest? Is it safe for a student to identify? Beth, you talked about sleep, definitely something that not only are our students struggling with, but our teachers, parents struggling with constantly. And then there's the whole curriculum and assessment. So there's all that pile of stuff happening, which is actually influencing more of the limited amount of sleep that our students could have. But I'm thinking the regulators are putting pressure in terms of inspections of schools. Leaders in schools are putting pressure because they want to be outstanding. And it's not only good enough to be outstanding anymore. It's almost like we have to be better than outstanding, because when the regulators come to an outstanding school, they have to prove that they're even more outstanding than they were the previous year. And then we have all those parental expectations, the parental expectations of, I'm paying for really expensive school fees. Teachers are required to give everything and go the extra mile. a little bit of sarcasm. Well, look how many holidays you have in a year, kind of, deterring the importance of that time off. Then there's all the overtime that teachers and leaders are doing that no one really understands. Maybe the academic day ends at 3 o'clock or 3:30, but a teacher most likely is probably turning into bed later than their corporate partners would be after coming home from the corporate world. And then there's leadership styles in education. In my research, what I came across is that if a leader is strained or stressed, that transfers onto their leadership behavior, and not always the intentioned leadership behavior that they hope to have with their colleagues, but it's that human aspect of a leader is human as well. And when they're not able to balance the disconnection that they're having in their work and their life, obviously that's going to tip over into how they lead, which then brings us back to the foundation of any type of community engagement. And that's having a safe foundation where colleagues and students and all members of the institution can be honest and say, I need help, or I feel like there's something not right. So my question now, and I'm going to bring it round the table again back to Dan, only because you're in that position of being in two sides of it, where you're managing that senior leadership team who's then managing their lecturers and then managing their students. You can see that trickle. As a leader, with any leaders watching this right now, from the perspective of CEO, what are the red flags that you identify for leaders with the right intention of wanting to make sure that it's a safe place where everyone is working in a healthy work environment, but at the same time, also being human and maybe not getting it right all the time?
Yeah. So when you look at the Blake Mouton leadership grid, which is one of the most widely used, you've got focus on task and focus on people. And the most effective leadership is where you are fully focused on both. You don't let the task go, but you also are very focused on the health and well-being of the team that's doing it, and they're feeling fulfilled. And I feel like, and Ashley, I believe, said it well when she was talking about emotional intelligence. As a leader, it just takes a tremendous amount of empathy to be able to understand what your team members might be going through, even if it's not your experience, and then to go beyond empathy to a level of compassion and meeting them where they need to be. And I think one of the big keys, whether it's for the team or with the students, is removing the shame and the fear. That there is no shame in putting up one's hand and saying, look, I'm getting burned out, or I've got too much on my plate right now. There's no shame at all in that. And there's also no fear. They're not going to be fired for that, or passed over for opportunities or things like that. Rather, they're going to be met where they are and provided with whatever can be done for them to help them achieve a level of well-being so that they're not feeling burned out. And I think that's something that all leaders need to do, because an organization is the people. And if you do not work with the people and meet them where they are and make it a place where they can have a proper work-life balance and a proper mental, physical, and emotional health, your organization is going to crumble very soon.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hollins, picking up on where Dan left off and saying, as leaders, we have to look at the task, but we equally have to keep our focus on our people being the important component of our institution. As you reflect on your role when you were the head of sixth form, what would you say were the red flags that you saw with senior leadership that you think, if I could go back in time, those would be the things that I would want to do different with my followers and my members?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really great question. I just kind of wanted to share something I'd been reading, because I think this spoke to me and spoke to what I felt was the things I would, like to focus on if I was in a leadership position. And I think it leans very well into what Dan was saying. And it's Dr. Christina Maslach and her co-author, I'm not sure of her co-author's name, it's Lighter, but they talk about burnout in any kind of sphere of work having 6 different factors. So one is workload. So obviously, like, the workload's too high, then that's going to impact on burnout. 2 is control, and I think that's really important. Like, so much of our identity is teachers and educators. It's our personal and professional identities come together because it's, I think, a calling for a lot of people. It's something they feel really, really passionate about. So I think where within the culture of a school, if teachers aren't having choice, if they aren't having input, if it's like, you can do this, but you can't do that, I think that's where you get a lot of friction. Rewards. So I say that in terms of people being paid what they deserve, but also being rewarded for their contribution, and getting that recognition as a school is really important. So I think that for leaders to be mindful of noticing that and what's going on with this within the school, because I think so much great work is unpaid, unseen, sometimes unnoticed, because people don't always want to shout about it. So I think it's trying to see things that people won't share themselves. The last 3, I think, are community. So having those collegial relationships, being supportive of each other, having each other's back, trust. I think having a trust within a school, both from teachers to leaders, but teachers amongst themselves as well, and allowing that to really grow. And the last 2 are values. So making sure that your values either are in line with the schools or they're not violated by the direction of the school. I think as long as they can live in harmony, you don't have to have the same values exactly. And the last thing is fairness. Like, I think we all know, we can notice when there's people being promoted over others that you think maybe are not deserving, and that really impacts on your well-being as well. So I think for me, particularly control and agency as a teacher, I think that's so important because it's such a big part of who we are. And I think recognition and also fairness as leaders, there are things to be mindful of.
What an incredible list that you've really highlighted for us. Thank you so much. So many things that I think we take for granted when we're thinking about educators, workload, and the rewards. I think sometimes, like you were saying, Dr. Hollins, educators become educators because it is a calling. They feel that it's something they really want to be doing to take care of younger people or to have a positive impact. But at the same time, it almost becomes a double-edged sword when those rewards are not, we're living in a material world, and we do need to be rewarded monetarily as well. But moving along, Ashley, in the work that you do, and I can see we've got some incredible questions coming through, so we're just going to kind of wrap up with Ashley and Beth's last thoughts and then definitely go to answer those questions. But Ashley, in the work that you do, in your description, you described that you believe the absence of mental illness is not conducive to wellness. And I want to pick up on that. And I think it's important because mental illness is another trending conversation. Definitely a different one to what we're talking about today. But can you unwrap very briefly for anyone watching this and thinking, Ashley, how do you create the absence of one in order for the other to be fulfilled?
Okay, so that statement, there's a lot in it to unpack and won't be able to do it all now, but I guess the gist of it for me is what I've noticed, especially in primary schools across the region, is there's counsellors there. Some schools don't have counsellors, but some do. And then their caseloads are overrun and children are in crisis. Sometimes it's parents that are in crisis, but then they're the children that are experiencing perhaps mental health difficulties. And of course, we can refer out to other clinics such as ourselves. But for me, I'm like, just because someone isn't displaying symptoms or signs of an illness or a difficulty, it doesn't mean that they're completely well and on that continuum of, optimal living. And like Dan was saying earlier, like eudaimonia, living a good life, there are also, I believe, a lot of things should be in place, preventative measures. And for me, that's where positive psychology comes in. We've actually written a wellbeing curriculum for primary children, because I think that every child needs access, and then they have the agency, like Dr. Hollins was saying, to pick and choose what works personally for them. So to me, there should be a lot more measures in place to make sure that all staff and all students have some element of wellbeing provision. And again, for some, that'll be conducive towards flourishing, and for others, it'll support where they're at on that continuum.
Thank you so much. That's definitely a conversation that we want to be picking up. Really important. And I love that you highlighted primary children. It's so important. We overshadow them. I think sometimes we assume that they're just having a lot of fun at school, but actually, I think if we can build the foundations when they're really young, by the time they get to the stages that Dr. Hollins and Dr. Adkins, that Dan have mentioned, they might already be self-aware and understanding that interconnectedness that Beth brought in. And coming back to you, Beth, I love that you are specializing in adolescence. Being the mom of teenagers and also working with teenagers on my everyday, I know that it's a very vulnerable stage of a young person's life. And sometimes it comes across as being rebellious or being secretive, going home and locking themselves in those rooms. If a teacher or a leader or even a parent were watching this right now, could you share some of your concrete strategies that you believe work with adolescents? If a parent, a leader, a teacher is identifying that there might be a potential for burnout with a teenager who, we have to admit, is going through an immense amount of pressure with assessments, course workload, and this idea of what am I going to be when I grow up?
Yeah, for sure. And adolescence, interestingly, we sometimes think of adolescence just as the teenagers, and it's not. It's a much longer period than that. It goes from 10 to 24. And so Pops explains also the difficulties that Dan was talking about when they get into university. I think this first point, and this is relevant to teachers as well, and note to some of the questions, that the first thing to do is just ask the students what they are struggling with. Teenagers, adolescents particularly, we sometimes assume that we know what they need help with, and we do this for educators as well. We assume, oh, it's just that you've got too much marking, whereas actually it's because you have a lack of flexibility or whatever else it is. So I would say ask them, because that's the first way we get that agency going. And linked to that agency, we have to get adolescents themselves to start looking at cause and effect, because only when they feel that what they do impacts how they feel, how they learn, their outcomes, will they start changing their behavior. And you can use data and little things to help them do that. So cause and effect is really critical, I think, in that first step. The second one, I would say there are not enough opportunities in their day, in school and at home, for stillness, when they can activate the default mode network. That is so important for them to stimulate creativity, for them to understand themselves better, for them to read other people better. There is very little stillness in their world, which is packed, fully packed, and it's completely counterintuitive, but you really should try and instill that in them. And finally, the elephant in the room, often when you're talking about adolescents, is technology's contribution to their well-being. And I say contribution because it can be positive, but it also robs them of moments of stillness. It can impact their sleep. It can impact their relationships. So again, speaking to them about the impact of that on their wellness and getting them to associate back to this cause and effect, its impact, and whether they can sort of master their technology use or not, is really important. And I just did a big study, spoke to children from all over the world about this, and they all identified, it didn't matter if it was Brazil or Bournemouth, they all identified the lack of focus and attention that they have, and they attributed this to technology, and they also felt that it just wasn't good for them. So having those three things, I think: ask them, agency, get that stillness in them, and don't neglect to discuss technology's contribution.
Thank you so much, Beth. Everything that you mentioned, everything today has just been incredibly insightful. Again, what I'm hearing is, are we having a conversation where we can change the system? Or is this a conversation about society education, requirements, and a much bigger conversation that we'll have to be bringing into our future webinars. I want to jump into the Q&A and pick up on, Beth, you were talking about agency. We have a question from Terrence Brady who says, are parents the primary agents of student well-being, and can we as educators in schools complement those family strategies? Who would like to pick up on that question?
I don't mind starting. I think it's helpful for us maybe to look not as if it's your responsibility or my responsibility, but all three of us, and students are in that triangle, if you like. So if we think of it as, and it obviously changes from when they go from the early years to through adolescence, but it's kind of all our roles. So what are all our roles? And I love that word that Terence used about complement. How can we all complement what we do? So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is being really consistent on the things that we are talking about. So we talk, and I know I keep banging on about sleep and exercise and relationships, but it's because they're all so heavily supported by science, and you know, I think that has much more power than preaching to children things that they think you've just come up with. So, you know, share with them the science, share with them why it's important, and get them to start that cause and effect. You can do that even when they're in the early years. How do you feel today? You seem a little bit up and down, or I'm thirsty. Okay, well, look, now that's the impact that drinking has on your ability to concentrate and so on. So I think I would start by looking at it maybe that more holistic point of view, so that the burden doesn't fall on any one person, including the young person, to have to manage their well-being. It's a community effort.
I completely resonate, and it's parent in partnership, isn't it? It really is. I think going back to the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, and it should be no different when we're looking at well-being. Another great question that just came through from Rafaela Capello that I'm going to direct at Ashley, only because it's about primary school children, and you are the expert today on that panel for primary school. Rafaela says, for primary school children, it's crucial to teach healthy eating habits, and seeing the statistics about how many children are overweight in, for example, year 6, it's not always a priority. She asks, how would you relate the lack of food education with their capability to manage well-being?
Okay, so I reckon, you know, this, I suppose the food education comes into different elements of primary education. So there's the pastoral, the physical education department, health, and I know in moral, social, and culture studies, they kind of touch on things like this. I think one of the issues is some of the curriculum are so cluttered that it's actually hard to make space for some of these things. So to me, the best way to go around that would be essentially if they're starting to notice patterns as such, and in that context there's something that needs to be addressed, then that's when more time is given to that, perhaps through assemblies, like dissemination of information to parents, through the health office, however it might be. But every context is different, you know, so there are some schools where children predominantly have very healthy lunch boxes. And then, of course, on the other side, there's perhaps different fast food comes in on the way to school, different things can happen, but it's making sure that if it's something that's popping up in a primary school and it's something you're noticing across all the year groups, or there's data around it, then it's addressing that in a contextual way that suits the culture of the school.
Thank you, Ashley. And I think it also picks up on something that Dan mentioned earlier on when he was saying that he looks at some of the clues, and some of those clues are a drop in attitude and a change in behavior. So maybe with primary school children, it really is something that can go across all age groups, in that it might be one of the clues or cues to identify that there could be something different, a change in appetite. So many incredible questions. I don't even know where to begin. Let's go down to this question that I'm going to ask Dan, if you can help us with this one. And it says, what kind of practices in your institution can you share? And I know you did talk about some of the strategies, but maybe just highlighting some of the best practices that you can share that prevent burnout amongst the educators and then the students.
Yeah, so for the educators, and Dr. Hollins listed off a number of different characteristics that matter, and it is constant involvement with the educators in what they're doing. So we discuss workload, which classes they feel comfortable taking, things like that. We have regular sessions where they're able to feedback on what's going on, and we can just have open dialogue about challenges that are being faced and best practice sharing among the practitioners themselves. We also really make it a point of making sure that everybody feels safe and understands that they're not going to be judged if they're having a little difficulty with marking and need some help with that, or need some extra time for prep and maybe a little lighter load. So we have that whole set of things going on. And then with the students, from their very first teaching period, we consider all of our first year students at risk, and we assign them a personal tutor who meets with them one-on-one a couple of times during the academic year to see how they're doing. And then they also participate in some group sessions where they can hear other students talking about their challenges as well. So we try and give the students a real platform and help them understand that what they're experiencing is normal and that there is support available to them to help them get through it and get to the point where they're feeling good about what they're doing.
Thank you, Dan. That's incredible. Great strategies. And I love that everybody is identified at risk in that first year, which means everyone is all at that same level, and it doesn't highlight one person from another, where we're looking at all of our students. That's an incredible strategy. Definitely something I would encourage leaders in all age categories to be looking at. Kona Batterjee asked, how do we improve the accountability of well-being in schools? Because schools are assessed or evaluated on many perimeters, but perhaps well-being is not one of those. Dr. Hollins, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I have slightly mixed feelings about the idea of well-being something that we assess at a kind of accreditation type level. I think I like it because it has to be on the agenda for change to happen. I think, some schools will take that on board and do it anyway, and some schools will need that, unfortunately, in order to make the changes. But I think in doing that, once you measure something, are you changing what's being done in order to meet those targets? So it's like, or are we putting in programs because we're getting assessed that we have to put in programs? Are they meaningful programs? So I think it is a good thing. I think we have to be very careful about how we do it, because I think it can end up turning people off wellbeing if we're not measuring it in the right way. So I don't know what the solution is, but I think there's a big discussion to be had there.
I love that,
Maria, about just on
Yes.
that data, because I think what Sadie said is spot on in terms of external data that schools need to prove something. But I think if we look at it like from an internal point of view, get students to measure their own well-being, their own sleep, their own technology use, and then that's their data. They're using it to inform whether they're going to make changes or habits they want to break. So it's much more powerful like that. So yes, of course we need data. We live in a world where, you need it to prove things and to, but it's the most powerful when you give it to the students themselves and ask them to use their own data to change their behavior.
Definitely giving them agency for being able to recognize themselves. I came across some research, and I was speaking to a colleague yesterday, and he was saying, how did well-being become so stressful to talk about well-being and bring well-being? Isn't well-being the opposite of that amount of stress? And I think you nailed it, Dr. Hollins. And when you were saying it's great to have it as an agenda, but is that the agenda, just to tick the box, or are we really caring about that? We have so many incredible questions, and we've got about 8 minutes to go, so we're going to kind of try to get through as many as we can. Israini says, well, that it's true the impact of burnout can influence our health, family, even in our society. How can we gain students' interest to study after they've got burnt out during that pandemic? I love this question because I get a visual when I see a question like this of kind of like the car breaks down, there's no petrol, but we're going to push it down the road because it has got to get to point B. Beth, how would you respond to that? Like a student that's already feeling burnt out, how do we motivate them to want to keep studying and to keep going? Or should we even be motivating them to do that?
It's a brilliant question. I think that the reason it's so good is because now we know that the careers for the future are not going to end. You're not going to pick a career when you're 20, 21, 22, and that's it for life. You're going to need to have an appetite for learning for the next, I don't know how many years. So burning out when you're, in your teens is awful. I think we need to step back, and I think it is our responsibility to reignite that passion for learning. But we need to, going back to this idea of the default mode network, we need to give children space in their brains to fall in love with learning again. And we might need to look at it more creatively, work with them. What are they interested in? And reframing learning, because once a child gets back into learning and feeling successful at something, that will translate across things. So if you can just, when a child is in that area of crisis, if you like, we need to make sure we're inserting periods of calm and stillness and pause, and then try to get them to lead the learning of things that they're passionate about. And once they get into that again and then build it up, that interest will spread. But I think we need to be patient and let it be student led in the first instance when they're in that moment of crisis. Because if they do find something that they feel passionate about and they get into that state of flow that Ashley and Dan were talking about, it doesn't feel like learning then. It just feels like a passion, and that's what we need. Because if you look at all those students who are head boy and head girl, they have loads of passions, and that's what drives them.
Thank you so much, Beth. We had another question come through saying, Susie Havhez says, I feel that today children have difficulty to manage their emotions and hence are not able to regulate them. And I know that we went across the board. Dr. Hollins, you talked about some of the strategies for colleagues, and I believe you mentioned from the author of I can't remember the name of the book and the author, but you were talking about workload control, rewards, community, fairness, recognition, and an alignment of values. Beth, you talked about stop making assumptions, asking young people, looking at that reflexive cause and effect, really understanding the reflexive, how did it happen and what was that impact? You also mentioned several times not enough opportunities for stillness. And I think and I'm wrapping this up just to kind of bring this question to fruition, in that I don't believe that from everything we talked about today, that there's only one strategy to help a young person. I think it is that partnership that we were all talking about. Going into our next question, it says, how can educators create a positive, inclusive classroom that supports our own well-being as well as the well-being of students? Dr. Hollins, how would you respond to that?
I think it's one, it's that idea of happy adults, lead to happy children. I think you set the tone, and I think students can feed off and they understand how you're feeling. So, you can't force that. I think that's a wider environmental question. But I think for me, it's modeling not being judgmental, like modeling at you making mistakes, modeling open discussions when we're not sure about things. I think being comfortable having discussions, I think, makes for an inclusive classroom. If everyone feels that they can ask questions and they're safe, I think everything else will flow off of that.
Thank you, Dr. Hollins. Susie asks another question. Teachers who have been highly suffering but not having the means to access any external help, what can they do? Ashley, you work with those who care for students and students. How would you respond to Susie's question?
I think it's a really good question, and thanks, Susie. I also think it's really about looking what's available in your area. So many health and wellbeing centres offer free support groups. There's lots of different networks out there where people can connect and really just find that safe space within their community to bring what's going on for them and perhaps finding solutions within that space. So I would just always suggest, there's so many teacher wellbeing groups around. I know that there's a few in Dubai. We run one one also, and it's just a space that people can come and say what's on their mind. So it's not therapy as such, it's not coaching as such, but it's creating that environment where people can come. You know, and again, we know that some services can be really expensive, but again, within that culture and within the centres, there you open up space to find something that suits you. So I'd say just check out what's around in your local community, because there will be some support groups.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ashley. Beth, I'm going to direct this next question at you. And I think this is more of probably something that we might want to be taking offline, but I think it's important to mention. We had a question coming in saying, hi, I'm a school counselor, and in my 5 years of experience, there's a culture of self-harm in secondary school girls, yet not potential to any other problem. As they opt the attitude, how should this counselor deal with this situation?
Yeah, well, I think we understand that self-harm is a response and perhaps a way of trying to control feelings, overwhelming feelings that you know boys and girls have, but girls certainly have a higher prevalence of self-harm. I think if we think of it as it's sad that it is considered as a coping mechanism now. And I think that social media hasn't really helped that, because rather than looking at other ways of coping, more healthy ways of coping, you know, the fact that this is there is difficult. I don't think that not talking about it is the right way forward. There has been over the past few years a thought, well, you can't talk about eating disorders or self-harm or whatever else, because that will make children do that. Well, we know that the internet shows them all of that anyway. So providing a safe space where they can talk about, you know, the feelings that they have. You know, we think that self-harm comes when they're really, really overwhelmed. So, you know, again, that work goes back to before they get to that really, really overwhelmed stage, what can we put in place? What strategies, when they're feeling like that, what sort of things can they do? You know, identifying, I feel like this, right, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try going for a walk. I'm going to try listening to some music. I'm going to try and go and talk to my person. So they feel they've got a toolbox of strategies that they can try before having to go there. Once they have done, I think the key is not, you know, making it shameful so that they can't speak to anybody, because we know if you can intervene at an earlier phase, and that has a much better outcome for self-harm and indeed many other disorders. So it's not an easy question, and I don't want to do it a disservice.
Exactly, so not at all.
No, you know, and I think also some teachers may feel not qualified to deal with that, and that's totally fine. And that's why I go back to, but they can ask, you know, are you sleeping well? If they're not sleeping well, that's a red flag. You know, no, I'm not, I'm still tired. You know, then they're more vulnerable to make choices about coping that are not so good for them. And so that's that communication between teachers and counsellors, you know, would be really critical.
You know, I really appreciate that question coming through, and I think it brings out the vulnerability that we place on particularly members of institutions who have a role designated to take care of well-being. And the question really unwraps the, I don't know how to help the student. How do I help the students? So I think it comes full circle in having the institution, as Dan was saying, and being able to really understand as an institution, how are we going to help? And then as Beth and Dan, you were both saying, having a specialty department that could then take it forward. Our final question, although there's so many more coming through, there's so many. Dan, I'm going to direct this one to you, because I think the question is directed to pick up on something that you mentioned in your first year students all being identified as, hey, we have to pay attention to everybody in that first year. Kwaku says, there was a suggestion that students are at risk at a certain level. His question is, for the teachers who organize sessions with those students, how do they go about making sure that the students are not overwhelmed by the workload, and how can they manage their students?
Yeah, so all of our faculty who are taking on this mentorship and tutorial role for the students have been trained by our team, so that our Student Success Center can oversee that, work with them, provide the materials, activities, things that they can do, questions to ask the students. So we've built up an entire ecosystem around this type of one-on-one student tutoring so that we can give effective service to all of the students. And then, of course, on the other side, to make sure it doesn't overload the faculty, we give them teaching relief, in other words, less teaching hours, in order to accommodate the additional work that goes into that tutoring and mentoring process.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to everyone who sent in a question. I apologize if we weren't able to get to all of your questions. My name is Maria Vitoratos, and today we spoke about key strategies for preventing burnout in educators and students. And the incredible panel with me, I'm going to reintroduce everyone. We had Beth Kerr, the Group Director of Wellbeing at Cognita, Dr. Sadie Hollins, who is the creator and editor of Wellbeing in International Schools, the magazine, Ashley Green, a wellbeing coach at the Free Spirit Collective, and Daniel Adkins, the CEO, Middle East of Transnational Academic Group. And I can see Danny's joined us again, so I will take a pause. Thank you, everyone, for being with me and for joining me in this incredible conversation. Danny, I think we could go on for weeks. This should actually become a PhD dissertation. There's so much to talk about. We couldn't do it all today.
I agree. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Maria, Ashley, Beth, Dr. Sadie, and Daniel. That was such an interesting discussion and very informative. Burnout is a crucial topic or issue that needs to be addressed. And like you said, Maria, the conversation could have gone on for hours and hours, but we've unfortunately run out of time for this webinar. We've had so many great questions come in. And for those that we couldn't get to, perhaps we'll send them across to you after the webinar, and we'll try to get back to those guests who asked them via email. We will also continue the discussions throughout the year, whether it's through more webinars or at GESS Dubai later this year, where many of the speakers that you heard today will be there to deliver live sessions at the conference. So make sure you stay tuned for more information. And if anyone from the audience has any further questions or would like to connect with our speakers, please send an email to marketing@gesseducation.com. You'll also be redirected to a short survey once we end the webinar. So please tell us what you thought and if there are any topics you'd like to hear about. And if you want to enjoy the webinar all over again, you can do so, as we'll be uploading it to our GESS Education website as well as our YouTube channel and sending it out to all attendees by email. A massive thank you to our panel and also you, our audience, for tuning in. As I mentioned, we'll continue to run webinars regularly throughout the year, so please make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter, follow us on social media, and visit gesseducation.com to stay informed of our latest events. Until next time, take care and have a great day. Thank you all, and bye-bye for now.
Bye.